Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Tilhill's Forestry Woodland Investment Seminar here today in Ripley. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you here all today. I was thinking to myself, when is the last time we actually did a Woodland Investment Seminar? And it's actually almost 3 years ago. It was in Cheltenham. I really enjoy these events. What are we trying to do with these Woodland Investment Seminars? I was thinking to myself again, and as many of you know, we run our headline event is the Forest Market Report, which we conduct in London and Edinburgh, double event in November. And for that event, that's where we really roll out our analysis, our kind of market insights as to what's been happening over the year. But because we've got so much data and so much exciting stuff to talk about to do with what's happened in the year, some of our clients said, what would be really nice is if we could have another event where we could perhaps dip in a bit more deeply into some of these other issues, trends, and talk perhaps in a bit more of an informal setting about some of these other things, which are really relevant to woodlands and investments and afforestation and everything else. So here we are. And I won't say anything about the topic, as hopefully that will come out of the discussion during the day. We've got 4 speakers today. 2 of them are internal Tilhill speakers, and we also have 2 guests. Our first speaker, Xander Mahoney, is a fairly recent addition to the Forestry Investment team. And when I asked Xander to provide me with a few bullet points for his introduction, one of them he said he was the help guy in the team for Excel, which I thought wasn't the most glowing recommendation, but actually I know he's going to introduce himself, and so I'll perhaps leave him to do that and set the stall out for the kind of topics we're going to speak about today. So, Xander, can I invite you to come up and commence the day, please?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to kick things off by answering a question. This is the question, but first, a little about me. I'm actually not a forester. My background is in investment, first off in the stock markets, but then I spent a lot of time investing in technology companies out in Silicon Valley. And this picture is actually from Apple's visitor center in California. And hey, look, they're using timber. But I'm not just here because I like trees. There's deeper reasons than that. Trees are this amazing organism that's sequestering carbon. And I'm of the opinion that in the near future, carbon sequestration is going to be like the next COVID vaccine that we just need to throw huge amounts of resources at for the good of the world. And while trees are sequestering carbon, they're also producing a resource, a commodity. And we're seeing right now just how valuable that can be. So I come at this as an investor. So this is a little summary of how I think about trees as an investment. So with forestry, we've got these net zero goals politically and also for the good of the planet, which are going to support timber demand because we need a lower carbon footprint building material. It's a finite commodity. It can be homegrown. It doesn't have to be imported. And we're seeing how important that is. It's an inflation hedge because you spend money today to plant trees, and then you get the income from those trees in 40 years' time's money. And at the moment, with the cost of living, I think the inflation that you could avoid in 40 minutes could actually be valuable. It's also tax efficient, which Emma is going to talk to us more about in a moment. And for afforestation, there's generous grant funding available to reduce the outlay, which Jay is going to cover also in detail. And then there's the potential also to earn carbon credits for some income in the near term. So the question, and this comes from something we hear a lot, which is the right tree in the right place. And so that begs the question, well, is there such a thing as the wrong tree? And actually the answer to that is yes. So what do foresters consider when they're planting trees? So I've broken this into a few sections. So the first one is, should we plant trees? Or is there a reason not to do so in that particular place? Can we plant trees? Are they actually going to grow? And then which trees should we plant in order to meet our objectives? And then finally, what about commercial conifers? Is there a place for them? What's the reason? So let's start with, should we plant trees? And our view is sure, right? We can sequester carbon. There's potential for biodiversity improvements. We can earn timber income. There's benefits to society. And we can also improve water quality and help reduce the flow of floodwaters. This is actually one of our professional tree planters. And these guys are machines. They can throw more than 1,000 trees in the ground a day. And I don't know if anyone here in the audience has ever tried it, but I definitely wasn't getting close to 1,000 in a day. So if we're going to do afforestation, planting trees at any scale, we do need regulatory approval. And there is a standard that we must meet. And you might even be required to dig in deeper and really kind of do an analysis of what the impact is going to be on that local environment from adding trees. And there's also some things that stop us from planting trees. We call these constraints. And there's a few of them listed there: protected habitat, peat, which is kind of a special example of habitat, and also archaeology. So let's have a look at a few of those. So certain habitats are already supporting a huge amount of biodiversity. And if we added trees to these landscapes, the species that are living there right now might not be able to continue living there. So some of these are protected, certain grasslands, heathlands, and also wetlands. And so if we talk about peat, which is a special example of a wetland, peat sequesters huge amounts of carbon, but it does it really, really slowly. I think to get a centimeter of peat, you'd need 100 years. So it's not really doing carbon sequestration on a human timescale. There's not really a point in trying to create new peat to solve the problems that we've created for ourselves in the world. But if we disturb that peat, and one of the ways we can disturb it is by planting trees, that huge amount of carbon gets released extremely quickly. And so if you restore peat that's either been eroded, which this peat down here doesn't look in great shape, or it's been drained, then you can stop those emissions, and you can actually earn carbon credits from preventing the emissions happening. And then this is perhaps a little bit of a silly example, because this is from this temple in Cambodia, and you could argue that the trees are now part of the archaeology. But it does show that trees can be destructive to history. So where there is history, of which there is a huge amount in the local area, what we do is we leave an open space around it so that people can continue to appreciate it, learn from it, and it's also protected from any damage. So now, can we plant trees? So the answer to this is yes. Trees will grow in most places in the UK. And to illustrate that, here's a picture of a tree growing out of another tree. But if we want trees to thrive, then we need the right species. So if we're going to be looking to maximize our income from timber or from carbon, we need those trees to thrive. So here's quite a simple example about how dry or how wet a particular site might be, and the types of species that you would look to plant given that. And I'll leave more detail than that to my forester colleagues in the audience. So now, which trees to plant? And this really depends on your objectives. So when we look to create woodland, we're in charge of what we want that woodland to do for us. And so we might be thinking about timber income, or wanting to maximize carbon credits, or thinking about the wider societal benefits. So let's have a think about timber income first. So this is really where commercial conifers come in. These trees grow fast, they grow straight, and it provides a recurring income stream on a time scale that you will actually see the income from the trees that you plant in your lifetime. So a little note about sick spruce, which is the key commercial conifer species in the UK. it grows extremely quickly, but there are areas in the east of England where that particular species is less suitable. Broadleaves, the timber can be less valuable, or it might take longer to grow. But oak's kind of a special case here where it's extremely valuable, but we're talking about planting oak for your grandchildren. And they'll be very grateful when they're harvesting this valuable crop of oak, but you'll be dead. So carbon credits. I think there's a bit of a misconception here sometimes that if you go buy a forest, that you can start generating carbon credits and then you can fly away on your holidays with zero guilt. But actually, you only get carbon credits for adding trees to bare land, for afforestation, creating a new forest. And kind of because of a technicality of how the regulation's written, broadleaves are going to earn you the most credits. But there are situations where you'd actually be better off with commercial timber, with conifers on that site, to maximize your income. There is a significant regulatory process with carbon credits. You need to register your scheme before it's planted. And then there's even a verification step where someone goes around and checks that you're actually sequestering the carbon that you promised to sequester. So now these broader environmental and societal benefits, and I noted grants in here because some of this correlates with the grant funding, which I'll leave to Jay to cover in more detail. So native trees have developed with our ecology over hundreds and thousands of years. So that's what's going to support the most biodiversity, the most species. They're also what you want if you want to support life in a river with the dappled shade to get the temperature right, but let some sunlight through to allow life to flourish. Any tree really is suitable for reducing runoff, and public access, if that's important to you, for the societal benefit, is suitable in really any forest, but it's worth noting that during the times that you are harvesting, the machinery is a little dangerous for people to be walking their dogs around. So commercial conifers. This is a slide about the UK timber market, and I think the most important thing to note is that we import the vast majority of our timber in the UK, particularly from the Baltic region. And we planted very little commercial timber between 1990 and 2010. And I knew I was going to regret not putting the maths on the slide to remind myself. So if we add 40 to each of those, so we'd be at 2030 to 2050, I think. We're coming into that period where the trees we didn't plant between 1990 and 2010, we now can't harvest. So there's going to be a fall in the supply, and that's going to be really supportive of timber prices for UK forest owners. And now, timber is an economically sensitive commodity. We use it for construction. But there's also going to be this structural driver of timber demand as it replaces these higher carbon footprint building materials. And this is a little graph just showing just how well timber prices have done over the last 20 years. So this is a little bit. This is my last slide, and what I want to leave you with. So this is land use in the UK. Is this map? It's a little counterintuitive because it's not where things are. We don't get all of our Christmas trees from Northern Ireland, for example, but it gives you a sense of the proportions of how we use our land. And we use a lot of land for pasture and not a lot of land for forests. 13% of the UK compared to almost a third for our neighbours in France and Germany. And there's places where it doesn't make sense. We've already talked about peat. We don't want to be planting trees there. We don't want to be using prime agricultural land for trees. But it's also worth noting that the UK's afforestation target is only 0.1% of UK land area per year. And amazingly, we have 1% of our country is golf courses. But still at these, if we even could get close to this afforestation target, it'd take us 10 years just to plant up the country's golf courses. And occasionally when I'm playing golf, that feels like it would be a better idea. clearly none of you have played golf with me, or that would have got a bigger laugh, I think. But the thought that I want to leave you with here is, whilst we don't need huge land use change in order to increase forestry cover in the UK, more trees is going to require just a little less of something else. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Xander. I think we're doing really, really well for time. So hang around, Xander, because I think we can perhaps try and field a few questions. I mean, I can kick things off. I mean, you mentioned about all of the timber that we currently get from the Baltic region in this country, and that we're going to have a supply problem. And you maybe suggested that timber demand in the world is growing. Where do you think we could? Where could the UK get its timber from in the next period? Can we do anything now about the next 20 years, or are we only able to do things now about the period beyond that?
So I think it's a complicated question. Where we currently get our timber from in the Baltic region, these countries are frantically currently trying to join NATO. And so that gives you a sense of the risks that there are to our timber supply. The other places that we're importing timber from are a lot further afield, the US, China, and even potentially places like Brazil, where how confident are we that that timber is actually benefiting the world and being managed sustainably? So I don't believe that there's a ready solution to the UK's timber need. And I think that's why you've seen when suddenly we wanted more timber to refurbish. Please do join us. No worries. When we've seen that the demand of timber spiked as we all wanted to refurbish our houses, that the prices went up because the market just can't react quickly enough to provide commodities to solve that problem.
Excellent. Yes.
What are your views about bringing in non-native trees so that you can get a balance between the commercial aspects when it comes to harvesting the timber, i.e. those that grow a bit quicker, and also sequestering carbon fast? Say examples of the sort of hardwood trees that perhaps we haven't grown much here thus far.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a slightly tongue-in-cheek answer about non-native crops, and I like to point to the potato that we don't seem to worry about as much as spruce. I come at this armed with a laptop and a spreadsheet, and so when I'm putting Sitka spruce into a spreadsheet and we plant it and we harvest it in 40 years, and we get the same amount of income as we would from, say, a pine or a Norway spruce, which is it's a European species, so kind of honorary native. I'm putting in that it takes 60 years to get the same income, so 50% longer. So it's not such a step change that I think you were insane if you wanted to stick just with the more native species. It's going to have an impact on the return, but ultimately, as a forest owner, that's your decision. The timber is still of excellent quality and would be sold into the same markets. But if you want to kind of maximize your returns, then Sitka spruce does the best job, and that's why we use it. In terms of for carbon credits from broadleafs, we would say plant a mixture. So a lot of it's going to be fast-growing species, and hopefully my forestry colleagues don't sigh as I say any of these things, but perhaps something like birch and sycamore, which will grow quickly and sequester the carbon that you want in a shorter period, so you get your carbon credits verified and in hand. But then also mix in some oak. Plant a crop that's going to be of value as part of your mix. Tend to it, prune it, get it to be a nice straight good crop, and then you've got that kind of second and third rotation income from oak.
Yeah, because it's a balance, isn't it, between sequestering as much carbon as rapidly as you can, and obviously hardwood, then you can use it in long-term solutions as well, so you continue to sequester once you've harvested it, versus bringing in the income from the timber itself.
Yeah, so if in the regulations, when your forest manager would do the calculations for you of what carbon credits you're going to earn, it is quite sensitive to how you're going to manage the forest. When you're planting a commercial conifer, it's assumed that you just clear fell the lot and that's it. And actually, I think it assumes that a lot of it's used for energy production, so effectively burned. And that's why you don't get as much carbon credits for the commercial conifers, even though they are actually growing faster and they can end up producing furniture and houses and things that are a lot more long-lived than firewood. But if you're going to be just kind of leaving the trees, that's what's going to get you the most, or if you're going to be kind of selectively thinning stuff, that's all taken into account. So there's a lot of moving parts in terms of how you plan to use the forest and the timber, or whether it's just plant the trees and lock the gate and let it grow.
I just wondered if you could comment about different regions, so differences between England, Scotland, Wales, but also you mentioned France and Germany having a different approach. Given your comments, are there any location factors we should be aware of?
Yeah, so I'll take the France and Germany question first, because other than skiing through various forests and pointing out annoyingly to ski instructors, oh, that's larch and that's spruce, and they don't really care. I think the most important thing to note about France and Germany is they are physically bigger countries than the UK. We have similar populations, but they are significantly larger, so they have more space. And with more space gives you kind of more options on how you're going to approach land use. But in terms of England, Scotland, and Wales, which is where Tilhill covers, so I'd say that the key things to note there is Scotland is the majority of the market, and I think Mike sat next to you probably has got some good stats on exactly how much of that is. But that it is the dominant force in forestry in the UK is Scotland. The thing to probably note on a afforestation perspective is there are different processes, different grant mechanisms. I'm not going to steal too much of Jay's thunder here, but how challenging it is to plant trees varies between the different countries. I'd say England is the trickier one, but there is, as Jay's going to talk about, a little bit more support available for the process that you have to go through as well. And I think that's probably...
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking while you were speaking there, Xander, in a way that there's different aspects to it, because from the carbon perspective, each of the countries is somewhat different, because in England there are some benefits like the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme, so there's a little bit more assuredness in England. Then equally, like Xander alluded to, perhaps on the regulatory side about getting permission for afforestation in the first place in England, your hurdle there is a bit more challenging relative to Scotland and Wales. I mean, we should bear in mind, in terms of woodland creation, Scotland has done the lion's share of it. There's been about 13,000 hectares per annum planted in this country over the last few years, of which more than 10,000 has been in Scotland. So Scotland's really scaling this much more. But interestingly, things like carbon credits tend to be worth more, let's say, in southeast England, because buyers of carbon credits are much more interested in having an accessible project that their customers can see, compared to, let's say, something on a remote part of Scotland. So there's a lot of moving parts, and each of the countries got their own grant scheme as well. So, yeah, many factors to consider relative to a forest, which, relatively speaking, is much more straightforward.
Thank you.
Gentleman behind you, Jordan.
Xander, you said you've got obviously lots of expertise on spreadsheets. So in terms of the carbon price, what are you factoring in sort of carbon, and how's that going to behave over the next, say, 50 years?
So it's unknowable. So what we're using right now is the current carbon prices. And so in the UK, that's around £15 per tonne. So a carbon credit is 1 tonne of carbon emissions. And that's for there's two types. There's the I'm promising I'm going to sequester some carbon bit, and then there's the when my tree has grown and I've actually sequestered some carbon. And we're about to see the first ever trade of one where the tree has grown and the carbon has been sequestered. And this tells you how new this is. And that's expected to trade around £40–45. But when you actually do the kind of maths in the spreadsheet and say, £15 now versus £45 spread over, you're going to get most of your carbon credits in the first 50 years of the project, but the project is 100 years. That actually works out to be about the same when you sort of take into account interest rates and such. The numbers that I like to think about is that if the carbon price was 3 times what it is now, which sounds a lot, but I mean, if it was 10 times what it is now, I don't think I'd be hugely surprised given the scale of the issues that we're facing. So if it was 3 times what it was now, then it'd be a toss-up as to whether, assuming timber prices were the same, it'd be a toss-up as to whether we're planting conifers or just getting carbon credits. Though with the note that you only get carbon credits on that first cycle. So you plant your new trees, and then for up to 100 years, you gain carbon credits. If you clear fell and start again, there's no more carbon credits after that. Whereas obviously with commercial timber, you're going to get the cycle off into the future.
But there's a nuance of that, isn't there? If it regrows, if it's coppiced, not under the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme, but I think that in the open market, there's potential that a coppiced woodland, i.e. that regrows, you could potentially get credits again and again for a period of time.
I'm not an expert on coppice. My understanding is that there's nuances in the grant scheme around coppice, and also coppicing in and of itself is probably quite challenging to make money from in the meantime.
Yeah, I guess then you get into the whole wide area of woodland management and all the different approaches. But whilst you were speaking, then I was just thinking of another thing is, really about the time value of money is such a big, important thing. And actually that's different for everyone. That's different for all different investors, and what's the alternatives for their capital, because and how severely the inflationary effects are for some investors relative to others. So I think that's really relevant, especially when you're thinking about carbon and whether or not your strategy should be early sales or promises to sequester, or thinking about speculating about future commodity price of carbon.
My approach as an investor, and it doesn't matter whether you're thinking about carbon credits, whether you're thinking about stocks in the stock market, is don't do it all at once. Because if you do it all at once, you risk buying at the top and selling at the bottom. Whereas if you do a little bit at a time, you're going to get the average result. So let's say that carbon credits, with some ups and downs, largely go upwards, and you just say, hey, we're going to sell a little bit each year, every 5 years, something like that. Then maybe you undersold some at the start, but maybe you gain a lot more from the ones later on, and it just reduces your risk. So that would be my approach.
Yeah, I think given the trajectory, that there's probably not a kind of short selling model here.
Yeah. I mean, if you're really brave, just hang on to them and wait. But that would keep me up at night if it was me.
Any others just now? Okay, well, thank you very much, Sander.
Thank you.
And there's a whole load of issues there, which hopefully we'll get to explore a bit more. But quite interesting to get started, at least on the carbon, which I knew was going to kick off straight away. So now, as they say, for something completely different, I'd like to invite Emma Elwes to come and speak to us about woodland taxation matters. Thanks, Emma.
How do I... Well, thank you very much, Tilhill, for inviting me and some of my colleagues here today. I thought before I actually did my talk, which is certainly not going to be as interesting as Xander's, because I'm talking about tax, so some of you might want to go to sleep when you hear that word. But I'm a solicitor with Pearsons & Ward Solicitors, but we are part of Ware&Kay. So I thought before I actually started talking, I'd just explain how we operate. I've been a solicitor specialising in private client matters, i.e. tax, estates, trusts, tax planning, for over 35 years. And for most of that time, I've been with Pearsons & Ward, who are based in Malton, North Yorkshire. And then in 2015, we merged with Ware&Kay Solicitors, who have offices in York and in Wetherby. So we are one big team. It's slightly confusing for people because we trade under Ware&Kay for our York and Wetherby offices, Pearsons & Ward still at Malton. But let me assure you, we are one big happy family, and we can cover a wide range of services for you and across the A64 corridor, really. I have some of my colleagues here with me today, and I'll just mention them, so you may want to talk to them later. I've got my co-director, Joanne Spittle, who is head of litigation for the firm, but has a huge amount of experience in agricultural matters and agricultural litigation, etc. I have Jackie Barr here, who is our agricultural property solicitor, again working across all three offices. She does mostly conveyancing, buying, selling farms, tenancy agreements, that sort of thing. And then I have my colleague Laura Schofield, who's helped put the slides together. She again works in the private client department, tends to float between Wetherby and Malton, but again covers all three offices. And both Laura and I have STEP qualifications, which means that we are supposedly specialists in trust and estate practice work. And so hopefully that gives us a bit of an edge, and we specialise in these things. So I think having explained that to you, perhaps if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk to you today purely about inheritance tax and how that might relate to forestry, woodlands. There's obviously a lot of taxes. We've got income tax, capital gains tax, VAT, stamp duty, land tax, but that's not under my remit today. The tax is a very big issue, and if you've got good accountants, they will no doubt be able to give you chapter and verse on the benefits of VAT, CGT, etc. So I'm going to just concentrate on inheritance tax. And I just thought we'd give you an overview to start with on what is inheritance tax, when is it payable. So generally, inheritance tax is what the tax you pay when somebody dies. And in essence, it's quite a simple tax. It's 40% on the amount above the nil rate band. What is the nil rate band? Well, it depends on an individual's circumstances, but basically, the basic nil rate band allowance today is £325,000. And if you have a house, and at the end of the day you're going to leave it to children, you might get the residential nil rate band, which at the moment is £175,000. So you add 175 to 325 and you get £500,000. If you're married, you've got double that. So you've got potentially £1 million worth of allowances. But unfortunately, that doesn't apply to everybody. And so the example we're going to give you today is of Bob. Bob obviously hadn't heard of forestry and woodlands, so he's got all his money tied up in his bank accounts and the stock market, and he's never married and he's got no children. His estate is worth £1.5 million, so he's only got the basic nil rate band allowance of £325,000. So you can see very clearly there, he's got a net estate of £1 million or 1.175 million, and at 40%, he's got a huge tax bill of 470,000 to pay. So the government have been, rubbing their hands in glee over that. So what could Bob have done? Are there any other reliefs that he might have been able to get? Well, there are some general reliefs which are applicable to everybody. If you give money to charity in your will or political parties, you could be exempt from inheritance tax, or those gifts would be. Gifts in lifetime tend to be exempt as well if you give something away and you survive 7 years. So the key is to start planning early. But the other reliefs, which I think are applicable today, are the business property relief, agricultural property relief, and another relief called Woodlands relief. And they're all relevant to woodlands, forestry, etc. So those are the ones that I'm going to concentrate on today, because they're presumably the ones of most interest to the people here. So if we go to the next slide, business property relief. Well, business property relief has 2 levels. There's 100% relief or 50% relief. And it really depends on the type of business you've got, the interest that you've got in that business. But basically, if you are a trading business and you have control, you could get 100% relief on those assets if you leave them in your estate. So what is the sort of business we're talking about? If you invested in, if you had some woodlands, it could be ancillary to some shooting rights, to a camping site, fishing, paintballing centre. You might have set up a log cabin business, and obviously timber generated for sale. But they're all related or allied, or could be, to woodland. The relief goes down to 50% if perhaps you've got a company and you've got maybe 50% of the voting rights or more in the company, but the relief tends to go down, and perhaps you've got land, buildings, or machinery, or your assets which are used in a business, perhaps a partnership, but you own them outside the partnership and they're owned or used by the partnership itself. Again, the relief can go down to 50% there. And again, similarly, if you have land, buildings, machinery used in a business which is perhaps held by a trust, again, you might have reduced relief at 50%. But you've still got 100 potentially, or even 50% is still better than no relief at all. So it very much depends on how you structure your business, the partnership, whether you've got a company. And again, your accountant, etc., can advise you on that, and we also assist. But it just shows you that business property relief is a very valuable relief, and it's certainly worth exploring. In any planning that you do, business planning, it's really important to get expert advice, both really professional advice, accountants, lawyers, and of course, Tilhill here, or their compatriots. Because if you're doing something and you want to plan and you want it to be successful, then you really need to do your homework and get it done properly. Because if at the end of the day, you're going to claim, or your solicitor, your executors are going to want to claim agricultural or property relief, you have to have done your homework. You have to be able to show that the business you're in is properly set up. There are regular budget reviews, a formal business plan, etc. It doesn't necessarily have to make a profit, this business, but it has to be a properly structured business, not just something written on the back of an envelope. And we've put up here that the Forestry Commission do a woodland management scheme and can help you, and I'm sure Tilhill probably can assist in similar things. I don't know. But it's important that you plan and you take advice from the experts before you venture into this world. So having talked about business property relief, we move on to agricultural property relief. So if you're a farmer, or you've got a farm, and I've talked to somebody here today who's invested in a farm recently, agricultural relief might be the important relief for you. It's slightly complicated, but basically agricultural relief is more or less 100% relief. But you have to meet certain ownership and occupation provisions. So if you have a farm, or you have a farming business, or substantial land, perhaps with forestry and other things on it, to claim agricultural relief when you die, you have to have either owned it yourself for 7 years and it's used for the purposes of agriculture, possibly by someone else, or you've got to, if you've only owned it for 2 years, you've got to have done the farming yourself. You've got to be actively involved in that activity yourself. So basically, you do get people who do invest because they want a quick fix for inheritance tax and perhaps buy some land, and maybe they've got a terminal illness. But you've got to make sure that you try and get in there early, because you have to own that land for 2 years and farm it, or be actively involved in farming it yourself. As I say, otherwise it's got to be the 7-year rule, and it's got to be occupied and farmed by somebody else, like a tenant farmer or so on. So it is a more complex relief, and there's a lot more to it than that, but that's just generally an overview of the agricultural property relief. So how would that fit in with woodland or forestry? Well, woodland's not necessarily automatically going to qualify for agricultural relief, but it might do if it's occupied with agricultural land or pasture. And perhaps the occupation of the woodland is ancillary to farming. So, for example, you may have a farm and you may have substantial woodland shelter belts. You might have some shooting on your land and have woodland for game cover, fox cover, coppices. You might actively farm the timber. You might have trees for amenity purposes. So, although the woodland in its own right might not attract relief, if it's done ancillary and as part of the bigger operation and the farming business, it's more than likely going to get agricultural relief at 100%. So short rotation coppice woodlands, I think, do qualify as farming, the intensive planting of trees, etc. But I gather the condition is it's got to be harvested no longer than 10 years. So I think to come out of that, you can see that woodland, the reliefs are potentially very valuable. There is a third relief, and that's called woodlands relief, but it really only applies to the value of the timber. When the timber is sold or given away, inheritance tax is due on the proceeds or the market value at that time. So, for example, if the value of the timber is increasing, you might want to delay making claiming woodlands relief. But basically, it's a deferral of tax. It's not actually a relief in itself. And it is only available on death and not lifetime gifts. And I think we've put up there, woodland relief is available when the deceased owned an interest in the land on which the timber's been growing for at least 5 years, or he received an interest in that land by gift or inheritance at any time, including within the 5 years. So, you know, the reliefs are available, not just on death, but if you give things away and you survive the requisite period. So you can see there's 3 potential reliefs that could relate to woodland. Business property relief, agricultural property relief, and woodlands relief. Woodlands can be useful to defer the tax, but you really do need to be very careful about that. And obviously, if you're going to invest, you need to consider what the woodland's used for to establish what reliefs might be available. So you can see from that investing in woodland has great potential. And as well, you can hopefully improve your carbon footprint. But I think if to emphasise here, I've said at the beginning, planning is incredibly important. Part of my job is to deal with people's estates and to try and claim all these reliefs once they've died and help the executors do that. And we have to complete a very long, complicated form called an IHT 400 with all sorts of supplemental sections. And I say to my clients, the best thing you can do at the start of the administration is get proper valuations, professional valuations of everything. Don't try and estimate things, do it properly. And the value of a professional valuation, if you're doing property from somebody, our ICS qualifications, a lovely valuation, pretty pictures, all the statistics there, it's, you know, HMRC today are like all these government bodies, they're short-staffed. They haven't necessarily got a lot of resources and time to check things. If they're looking at an IHT 400 form that's got a really good professional valuation and stats and everything in it, you're a long way there to getting those reliefs. If you try and do it yourself and estimate and send them all sorts of scrappy bits of paper with various figures written on, they'll think, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? We better look into this. And they'll turn it into an estate where they're going to do a compliance check. So I think professional help is really, really important and will get you a long way. But I've done many estates in my career, and we've claimed woodlands relief, agricultural relief, business relief, property relief. I'm doing it all the time. And, you know, generally, there's very few instances where when I've claimed it, I haven't got it. There's an issue over farmhouses and things like that. But generally, you know, if it's well set up, the revenue don't have a problem with it. And so it is a good relief to have. And as I say, hopefully, if you can, or you're considering investing in woodlands or forestry, you can not only improve your carbon footprint or whatever, but you can save some tax as well. And that's, well, everybody wants to save tax, don't they? So generally, I think, I'm not sure I can say a lot more about it, but hopefully I've headlined for you the benefits and the reliefs. My colleagues and I are going to be here round and about, so if you do want to come and see us afterwards, then please do. I'm happy to try and take some questions now if anybody wants to ask some questions, but yeah. Otherwise.
Thanks, Emma. Hang around.
Oh, right.
Because I'm sure we may have a couple of questions here. Before I open it to the floor, there's one that's been in my mind whilst you were speaking. And just to say, first of all, thank you so much for bringing that to our attention, because I have to confess, before this event, I did think, oh, God, I guess we have to have the tax talk. But actually, it's been a few years since we had it, and it is a timely reminder, because like you say, it does affect us all, and it's especially relevant in these kinds of investments. And there are things that we need to be thinking about in terms of how we manage them. Thinking about afforestation and tax, one aspect that's come out quite a lot recently is many of our clients look at perhaps purchasing farms where there needs to be a land use change because the existing farm is not a going concern. There may be a kind of derelict house or something like that, which is part of what's purchased. And in due course, much of the land may be turned into a forest, and the investor is left with a house, and let's say a house and 10 acres, you know, is the typical scenario. And the purchaser of that may not necessarily be a farmer in a full sense of the word. They may be a lifestyle buyer, or it may be a small holding, or they may be doing something else. Can you say what your thoughts are on how that could affect tax? And are there any things that investors should be thinking about, or you know, to not fall into a pit or trip up with that?
So are you really saying, is that house likely to qualify for relief?
Yeah, exactly. With what I guess
with
I'm
the
getting
10
to is,
acres or whatever.
would you lose reliefs if you kind of structured it or gain them if you kind of actually did it slightly? Let's say, if you'd made it 11 acres, not 10 acres, or you know, filled in a different form, that would have been better.
Well, I think the rules are that the house has to be in proportion, really, and allied to what you're doing. So I think it might be difficult to get agricultural property relief on a house with just 10 acres and the forestry. I suppose if you could show that you needed to live in that house to manage the forestry, you needed to be on call or whatever for security reasons, you might. It's an interesting one. I think, you know, I'm a great one. I tend to claim it and argue what I can afterwards. But I think generally a house with 10 acres and not sort of ancillary to the general farming or just for business purposes, unlikely. But of course, you may get property relief, the residential nil rate band that I talked of at the beginning. Yeah. So whilst your house may not qualify for agricultural or business property relief, it may qualify for this residential nil rate band, which if you're a married couple would amount to 350,000 to set against the house. Yeah. So you might not get that relief, but there might be some alternatives.
Okay, thank you. Right. Questions from the gentleman at the back?
Yes, please. The tax relief and advantages, are they applicable to a UK company that has bought or owned land overseas?
I'm not going to go into that detail because I'm not an expert on cross-border estates or whatever. I think it is complicated. I'm just talking here purely about UK tax. It gets very complicated when we start going cross-border. So I'm going to duck out of that one. Your accountant may well know.
Yep, on here, please.
Yeah, hello. We're foresters. We don't know anything about agriculture. I'll never buy a farm, but I'll buy more forests.
Right.
From the point of view of a private investor buying a forest, would you say that we are better off, from a tax point of view, treating it as a commercial business rather than as a woodland?
Yes, I think.
But you don't need to actually carry out any commercial activity. Because the stage we're at now, anything we buy will probably be dead before any clear felling occurs. Although the stuff we bought previously were now at the stage of clear felling. So we don't actually need to prove any commercial activity, just the intent of commercial activity.
I think that's fine. You run it as a trading business, presumably, do you? You run it as a business, or is it?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. And you've got accounts, annual accounts, that sort of thing?
Yeah, we've actually chosen to claim and pay tax
Yeah,
on it to prove that
absolutely.
it's run as a business.
If that's running a business, I see no reason why you wouldn't get business property relief when you die. So the taxes I'm talking about are, you know, what would happen if you die tomorrow and the value of that asset is in your estate. Will you get relief other than the ordinary nil rate band relief? Yes, you probably would if you can prove it's a trading business and you've got the accounts. And as I said at the beginning, you set it up properly, you do your budgets, etc., and you can show it's an active business.
What mileage do you think there is in using a self-invested personal pension as a tax wrapper for a woodland purchase and keeping it
I think
in that wrapper?
the self-invested, the SIPs, obviously should be outside your estate for inheritance tax purposes. So if you put it into a SIP, it shouldn't form part of your estate, providing the rules are applied to. So it doesn't even come into your estate if it's in a SIP, if you've done it at the correct time. So yes, there's a lot of advantages to putting it into a SIP if you can.
If I may, an ancillary point to that is that though, just be aware that your SIP provider may, I believe, have their own requirements. For example, for valuation, for buying forests and that kind of thing. So you might just need there's a bit of devil in the detail.
There is. I mean, I'm giving you very much an overview. Because obviously there are all sorts of restrictions on SIPs. You can't have residential property in a SIP, for example. It's got to be commercial. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't have woodland, but as Philip said, EOP said, you should take expert advice and your SIP provider will tell you what you can and can't do.
Yeah.
Somebody else may correct me if I'm wrong here. Under the age of 55, you can still use your SIP to purchase commercial property. Over the age of 55, you can use it to purchase non-commercial woodlands. Does anybody know if I'm right there? This does confuse financial advisors because, they'll invest in the Canadian stock market, but when you talk about forest and woodland investment, they start scratching their heads because it's a bit esoteric.
I'll answer by just completely ignoring the question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
That works.
I don't know the answer, the detail of that.
The exposure I certainly had to SIPs was we had an incident, a client attempted to buy a woodland, which actually would have worked, I think, completely fine from a BPR perspective, but because it was coming through the SIP, actually there were elements on the kind of legal aspects of the characteristics of the property that meant it wasn't an investable asset from the SIP's perspective, even though the underlying client actually wanted to proceed with the purchase. So that's why I say I think you just need to understand what are the requirements of the SIP. But otherwise, the BPR approach...
I would have thought so,
Yeah.
It's fine.
We've probably got time for another one or two. Yes, one at the front.
If you're running if you're running an investment company, a financial investment company, which you're wishing to transition into a commercial woodland business, at what point, perhaps percentage-wise, do you have to transfer assets into woodland to make it then a trading company rather than an investment company from an inheritance tax point of view?
and perhaps Laura could help me here, but I think you would have to show that the majority of your income is from the woodlands before you're going to start getting that relief. So if you put your woodland in and it's only 20% and you've still got investments 80% in something else, it's unlikely. I think you've got to get that business relief on that company, on those company shares. You would need to show that the majority of your income is coming or derived from that woodland.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Onwards with the next speaker. Our next speaker, Jay, works in Tilhill. He's an absolute expert on afforestation process in England, and I've seen his presentation, so I don't mind introducing him like that. So notepads at the ready for this one, and I hope Jay's going to give you a really, really good background into the English process and what are the especially opportunities from the grants and maybe pitfalls on the reg side. So Jay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Not sure I'm so welcome enough the title of an expert in woodland creation, but you know, yeah. So as Peter said, my name's Jaylee Sanderson. I work out of Tilhill's Northwest office at Kirby Lonsdale. I'm one part of a small team that's tasked with covering business development across the entirety of England. At the moment, the vast majority of our workload is centred around woodland creation, and that can be involved with, specifically with woodland creation design, with regulatory navigation in terms of woodland applications, and also in terms of advising clients and also internal forest managers on the possible grant funding options available to them in England. And I must qualify at this point that there is quite stark regional differences in terms of what grant funding is possible across the UK. Wales and Scotland have totally different options. I'm not an expert on them in any way, shape or form. So if your area of interest is in Scotland or in Wales, please come and tap us on the shoulder at some point today and we can put you in touch with some regional experts that we have in those areas. So I'd just like to start off by just clearly there's going to be quite a wide range of experiences in terms of woodland creation, woodland ownership in the audience. Some people may be, old-hearted, they've owned or invested in woodlands and forests for quite a long time. Other people may be quite new to the journey. So I am going to start off at basics. So forgive me if it sounds like I'm teaching you to suck eggs. There is people that don't understand or don't fully have the heads around the basics at this point. So I think it's fair to say that each person in the audience will have their own reasons why trees, woodlands and forests are important to them. But essentially that's not the reasons why grants exist in England. Grants exist in England because woodland provides public benefit, and that's essentially the reason why grants are there for us today. You can see on the right-hand side on the slide on the screen, there's a very brief list of public benefits. Xander touched on some of these earlier on. I won't dwell on them for too long, but I'll just provide a little bit more context. It's clear that we're in the midst of a climate crisis at the moment, and trees do still represent a primary tool for drawing down atmospheric CO2 and locking that up in timber in a steady state, potentially long term, if that timber is used for the right outcomes, such as buildings and that sort of thing. A slightly lesser known crisis that we're in would be a biodiversity and nature crisis. I think as urban conurbations increase, the pinch is placed on priority habitat, and woodland certainly represents a priority habitat. It's an important habitat, especially when woodland creation is undertaken in relation to existing woodland, directly adjacent to existing woodland, I mean by that, and also when it links existing woodland. I think moving on, we can kind of lump soil and water management together very loosely. It's clear that when we increase tree cover in a catchment, it does a number of things. It consolidates soils, and it also increases the hydraulic roughness in the catchment. And what that essentially does is it prevents water movements or slows down water movements after peak rainfall events. And the knock-on effect from that is a reduced sediment load into watercourses. And the benefit we get there is obviously cleaner rivers, cleaner lakes. It's good for public and it's also good for nature as well. I think recreational use, that's kind of, there's indirect and direct benefits there. The direct ones would be where a landowner decides to allow public access for dog walking and that type of thing. But there's also indirect benefits as well in terms of visual amenity, essentially. And also at the woodland planning stage, the more productive species we place into a mix, you know, that has the potential to produce good, usable timber in the long term, which all aids the rural economy. In addition to these public benefits, as woodland owners, as landowners, there's obviously an additional set of perks that you'd enjoy. These obviously include direct recreational use, potential sporting enhancement, as well as economic benefits in the form of carbon, timber and third-party income, and also hopefully increased land value in the longer term. So with these benefits in mind, I'd just like to have a brief overview on England's historic tree cover performance, and also look at the aspirations that the various governments in the UK have in relation to tree cover. So actually in the UK, England's performance has been pretty pitiful, and Scotland and Wales typically outperform England in terms of tree planting and woodland establishment. And if we look at the data, you can see in 1924, tree cover percentage across England was 5.1%. In the 96-year period that led to 2020, a concerted effort to replenish the nation's woodlands and forests saw us reach a tree cover percentage of 10.1%. Now, governments across the UK currently have aspirations by 2025 to be planting 30,000 hectares per annum across the UK. And what this will mean is the following 25-year period, starting in 2025 and leading up to 2050, would see tree cover in England exceed 12%, which is obviously really good. And the government do realise that in order to make that, to realise that aspiration, they need to provide pretty good economically attractive grants, and that's exactly what they've done. And they have earmarked a £440 million pot of cash titled the Nature for Climate Fund, specifically 500 million of which is earmarked for trees and woodlands alone. And this is to be distributed via a series of grants. The mainstream ones in England are the Woodland Creation Planning Grant, the England Woodland Creation Offer, sometimes you might hear that called UCO, and also the Trees for Climate Offer. Quite simply, these grants represent the best grants we've ever had in England, and we'll just discuss those in a little bit more detail. Essentially, what we have is two grant types. The first of all is a discovery grant or a scoping grant, and this is paid purely to ascertain the likelihood of being able to plant a given plot of land. The mainstream grant, or the only grant really, the only discovery grant available in England at the moment, is the Woodland Creation Planning Grant. That brings us on to the second type of grant, which is a capital grant, and these are the grants that are essentially paid to cover the costs associated with actually planting the woodland, so paying for your trees and your labour and that sort of thing. And of the mainstream grants available in England at the moment, there's two essentially. There's the England Woodland Creation Offer, or UCO, which is essentially the bread and butter of grants that go on in England at the moment. And there's also the Trees for Climate Offer. It's important to point out at this point, if you're a landowner with an aspiration to achieve a grant-funded woodland, the capital grant is compulsory. You do need to go through a capital grant process in order to receive your grant income. But the discovery grant is purely optional. It's purely there as a tool to landowners, as I say, to ascertain the plantability of the site. So with that in mind, we'll move on and we'll speak a little bit more specifically about each grant. We'll begin with the Woodland Creation Planning Grant, which if you remember a moment ago, we described as a discovery grant. It's essentially a two-stage grant. Stage one is basically concerned with, it's essentially a desk-based exercise, and you're looking at constraints and you're looking to identify stakeholders, and you could be looking at things like priority habitats, priority species, designations, historical interest. And essentially what you're doing is you're gathering a large ream, a comprehensive ream of evidence which supports the project moving forward. And as you're doing this, you're starting to identify which stakeholders may have interest in your your initial scheme, which we'll call at this stage a concept scheme. Essentially what you do then is you will submit for stage 1, you provide that to the Forestry Commission, and they will assess the ream of evidence that you've gathered and also stakeholder comment, and they will decide whether or not the scheme is likely to move forward, and they will offer you stage 2 if the answer to that question is yes. In doing so, they may suggest that you undertake a series of surveys. If that's the case, one of the benefits of the Woodland Creation Planning Grant is that 70% of those imposed survey costs are actually met. The remaining 30% is at the expense of the landowner. So essentially what stage 2 does is it progresses the project and it starts to manage any surveys, and it starts to take stakeholder comment, and it starts to fine-tune the woodland plan. And this is what's presented back to the Forestry Commission at the end of stage 2. And essentially what comes out the back of stage 2 would be a UKFS, or a UK Forestry Standard compliant planting plan. And this is what we move forward into our capital grant application, which, as we described earlier, is the grant which actually secures you the funding. Just speaking monetarily, at stage 1, regardless of scheme size, for Woodland Creation Planning Grant, you'll get £1,000. At stage 2, you paid £150 a hectare, but you do need to subtract the initial £1,000. And then, as we've just described, 70% of any imposed survey cost is also met. So moving on, the first of the capital grants, which is UCO. Barriers to entry with UCO, the minimum scheme size is 1 hectare. That doesn't need to be continuous. It can be made up of smaller areas, providing no area is any smaller than 0.1 of a hectare. Essentially under UCO, there's 3 payment threads, the first of which is titled standard cost items, which the standard cost items you can see in this grey box. And what standard cost items do essentially is assign a value for each unit that you plant. So for each tree, each protection tube, and also each metre of fence or each gate. The maximum maximum achievable amount under standard cost items is £8,500 per hectare, which represents a marked increase on the scheme's predecessor, which was £6,800 per hectare. The second payment thread is titled additional contributions, and these are paid in a much different way to your standard cost items. These are paid on an area basis, and essentially what we have is a predefined set of spatial targeting areas which all relate back to those benefits that we've seen at the start. So it's as simple as if your land parcel falls within these spatial targeting areas, you qualify for that additional contribution. Some of them are a little bit more complicated. You see the nature of recovery at the top. You'll see the bracket runs from £1,100 per hectare to £2,800 per hectare. And the thing there is whether you're in high or low priority. And essentially it relates to whether or not your woodland creation scheme is planted directly adjacent to existing deciduous priority habitat or not. So there's some subtle nuances in there as well. Moving on to the third payment thread, that's much more simple to describe, and it's related to maintenance payments. Essentially, you pay £300 a hectare per annum, and that again, that's a £100 per hectare increase over what we had previously. The maintenance payments are intended to pay for things like weeding of your trees and basically anything that takes your tree from a newly planted whip up to an established woodland. So as we move on, we'll stick with capital grants and we're looking at the Trees for Climate offer. The Trees for Climate are essentially community forest exclusive. And what I mean by that is if you look at the graphic on the left-hand side, I don't know whether you can make it out to the back, but the dark grey areas represent the 13 community forests in the UK. There is quite a northern bias there. And essentially a very rough description would be that they follow the M62 corridor west to east. They also extend up into Yorkshire and across to the Yorkshire coast. That's the vast majority of them. The next biggest one would be the North East Community Forest, which came online late last year. Essentially, Trees for Climate works in a very, very different way to UCO. There's no specifically assigned values for standard cost items or for providing benefit. It's rather assumed that all woodlands provides benefit. And how it actually works is if you as the landowner come to Tilhill and you want to plant a 10-hectare woodland, we would provide you with a quotation to navigate the regulatory process, supply the trees and all the materials required, and also for the labour to put the trees in the ground. And you as the landowner would then take that quotation forward to the regulator, which is the specific community forest, and your grant funding amount will be based upon that quotation. With that in mind, theoretically, there should never, under Trees for Climate, be a surplus in grant funding back to the landowner, which is not the case with UCO. There should, under UCO, or potentially could be, a surplus back to the landowner. Via Trees for Climate, the funding is also released in a far different way. It's essentially released over a 10 to 15 year period, possibly, with 70% released immediately after planting, after inspection, 20% being paid on tree establishment, which should be between years 3 and 5, and the remaining 10% paid on woodland establishment, which could be anywhere between years 10 and 15. So I think there's quite a lot of option there, you can see. So as with anything with options, there's pros, there's cons. And this is quite a clumsy graphic, I think, so I'll just talk you through it. If you imagine, we want to begin with a woodland creation project. We're at our start line, and where we want to get is way down the bottom there. We want to be at the end of a UCO or Trees for Climate application. And there's 2 potential routes to get there. There's the route on the left-hand side with the 2 small green arrows, the first of which is the Woodland Creation Planning Grant. The Woodland Creation Planning Grant is great because it pays you £1,000 at the outset to begin to investigate whether planting is possible. The downside of it is you're probably looking at 18 months from start to finish for a planning grant. And then afterwards, you do need to go through the capital grant funding mechanism, which can take a further 6 months. So definitely the route on the left-hand side, it's great because you receive 70% funding for any survey if it's deemed required, and you're also getting that initial £1,000, but it is quite timely. The second route would be a capital grant standalone route on your right-hand side. That can probably take about 9 months from start to finish. You have got the slight worry that if there is any imposed survey, it would be 100% at the cost of the landowner. But yes, in terms of project progression, it certainly offers a benefit in terms of time frame. So that brings us on to grant strategy. And to my mind, when we go out and speak to landowners who are interested in planting a new woodland, this would be the area that they get caught up on for the longest time. And it's how we use those grants, which grants do we use. And essentially, in my mind, there's 3 things to consider. That would be site size, site constraint, and the timeline we need to work to. I think if you've got a small site with minimum constraint, a standalone capital grant is perfectly applicable. However, if you've got a large site or a site that's potentially got some significant constraint on it, you could be looking at a planning grant combined with the capital grant route, which is at the detriment of time, as we've described previously. I think to summarise strategy, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. I think it's about looking at what your site and what you need to achieve. You've got to take your own situation into account and choose one of the 2 routes on screen. And that summarises my talk on grants. I hope it's been useful, a brief insight into the grants we have available in England at the moment. If anybody does have any particular projects they'd like to discuss, I'll be around for the rest of the day. Feel free to come and give us a shout, or there'll be business cards about, give us a call or an email. And we do generally, if you're quite interested and you want to progress things further, we do generally offer a free site visit to come out and walk the land with yourselves, flag up any glaringly obvious issues, and just in general discuss how woodland creation and more specifically grants might work for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay. Can I invite any questions? Oh, one right from the back there.
Hi, Jay. Thanks very much for that there. It was just on the UCO part there for the establishment funding. So I don't know if it was my eyesight back here, but was there anything there for actual land prep involved with UCO?
Yes, there is an option available. It wasn't on the slide. It's quite an exhaustive list of standard cost items under UCO. So that was just a brief summary. Okay. But there is, yes, there is an option for land prep, which covers things like scarification or mounds, and potentially, I think the figure is £600 a hectare.
Okay, no, that's pretty good. And that, is it working still? Yeah. Is that 8,500? Would that more or less cover 100% of the costs most of the time, or?
It's totally reliant on scale. If we're talking something kind of sub 5 hectare, probably not. But as we go up in size, then yes, certainly we'd be expecting there to be a surplus back to the landowner.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Colin.
We're Scotland, not England. If you look at the history from the Second World War, forestry plantations, rotation felled, replanted, rotation felled. You end up 4th rotation now. So you end up in a situation where you're doing the 4th clear felling on a Sitka site. You find yourself in exactly the same position as somebody staring at a 100-hectare field, thinking, okay, I want to replant this now, but I want to do something that's more biodiverse, more resilient to pest, wind throw. And so you're standing next to somebody who just has a clear field, and they have grant funding available to them, but you don't. And with a depressed timber price now, where does that leave someone like the forest owner who really can't afford to replant once they've clear felled?
Yeah. First of all, I'd just say that in terms of Scotland, I'm not overly familiar with the grants on offer there, but I'm pretty sure that, yeah, you're right, there's nothing available, and that must be unbelievably frustrating.
Well, after Arwen, and then Dudley, and then Malloch, we weren't hit too badly, but I know people who've been absolutely flattened. And now there's no sawlog value in the timber whatsoever. It's going off the biomass. And the power stations are saying, hold on, we've got too much biomass now, because everybody's been squished up there. Yeah. And so you've got people who aren't even at end of rotation now with worthless plantations that are only 16 years old. No good for anything.
Yeah, to my mind, there's nothing available.
I mean, it's not an ideal situation. I think it comes down to storm risk, and unfortunately, that's one of those negatives. On the plus side, I guess, hopefully, some of those people will be putting in claims at the moment. I appreciate wind throw insurance isn't ideal for what it could be in forestry, but I guess that's the official, technical answer to that one.
But from the point of view of acquiring land, there's a lot of land up there where you can actually plant fresh. But you're looking at global warming and over a 30 or 40 year time scale, and you're now looking at ilobius problems. You're now looking at wind throw problems. What liability does the landowner actually have for replacing trees which have been damaged by infection or sort of acts of nature, acts of God, 30, 40 years down the line, if you've sold that property on? Yeah. Because any felling license, when it comes in, it says for 10 years, you'll kill all the rabbits, you shoot all the deer, you'll eradicate all the pests, which is fair enough. And that's at cost to you. At what point does your responsibility for maintaining this site go away? Yeah,
again, in a Scottish context, I'm not overly familiar with that setting. But yeah, you're right, you do have an obligation to maintain that woodland.
I mean, this is one of these things, it depends on the grant schemes and the rules of the grant schemes ebb and flow somewhat. There used to be grant schemes which had up to 30-year tie-ins even with obligations to maintain. I think the current ones, the obligation period is somewhat shorter, and obviously you do need to ensure that you fulfill the contract. I mean, normally speaking, that shouldn't be onerous in that it would be your objective in any case to maintain stocking density once you've got the income, because actually your long-term timber productive potential is based on maintenance of that stocking density of trees. So, there's not any awkward incentives. The incentives are correctly aligned. And if you were to exit through sale, then, of course, you, as part of that process, would hand over obligations to maintain. contractual obligations, which is fairly standard. I think we probably need to move on to the next speaker, unless there was there was one more here. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just a quick one. Thanks. I know you said you don't deal with the Scotland and Wales stuff specifically, but do you know sort of the relative amount of money that you get for the grants? I know England's much more expensive relatively to Scotland and Wales, so do the grants sort of even that out a bit?
I can take this, Jay, if you like.
Yeah,
it's. I mean, Jay made the point that the grants in England now are the best we've ever had, and I mean it's really phenomenal because before this time it used to be the Welsh one in aggregate over the full period was the best at like 8,000-9,000 a hectare, and you've seen on the UCO if you actually your base levels around about there, and then with these additional contributions, depending on which layers you're falling on, you could be up to 15,000-16,000 a hectare. Now, of course, the dynamic in England, you've got lots of moving parts because you've got carbon, land price, lots of other factors. But actually, I think the exciting thing is much of England, from a business kind of investment perspective, hasn't made sense when you run the cash flow because of the land entry price. But with UCO and the right additional contributions and on the right site, actually we're finding we can make things work. So that's the kind of the opportunity, as it were. And grants in Scotland are still haven't changed significantly in many years, so they're still way down, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 a hectare, something like that. Obviously, the grants, as I say, are just one element of the whole thing. So you need to look at the thing in the round. But definitely, England's back in the game, I'd say.
Smashing.
If that, yeah. Right. We've had one more speaker, and then we're going to have a short Q&A, and then we can get on to lunch. So for our final speaker, now, as they say, for something completely different. And there's been a lot of talk about rewilding, nature, and how these things impede upon woodlands, biodiversity net gain, many terms being bandied around at the moment. Daniel's, I will allow him to introduce himself, but I think the topic as a whole is something, as either existing owners or prospective forest owners, is something we need to be thinking about, because actually, if you're thinking of a kind of whole forest monetization approach, where we're not just blinkered on thinking, okay, our forest is about timber production, but actually our forest can deliver many other things, and actually some of those, from the investment perspective, can in due course be monetized. That's the extra opportunities where we can derive the highest and best use from land. So I hope that was the right introduction for you, Dan, and we'll look forward to your speak.
So morning everyone, I'm Dan, I'm Rewilding Services Lead with EcoSulis. I mostly work on our projects in rewilding finance and innovation. So EcoSulis, we're a traditional consultancy, so doing things like newt surveys, bat surveys, offsetting development. But in 2013, a decision was made to be the first UK business to dedicate our purpose to rewilding. And specifically, we feel there's a need for a pragmatic approach and to make it investable in order to accelerate the vision of a recoverable earth within our lifetime. It's great to be invited here to talk a little bit about what rewilding is and what it can do for both people and nature. And we're especially excited as our collection of Yorkshire projects is quickly growing. So rewilding can mean different things to different people and conjure up different feelings, reactions. To some, it's a kind of panacea. To others, it's a bit of a Pandora's box, and to many, it's kind of somewhere in between. If we're looking for a definition of rewilding, personally, I like Chris Sandham's, which places emphasis on spaces of both physical and intellectual innovation, the restoration of natural processes, and the resurgence of species that play a functional role in ecosystems. So rewilding reflects landscape scale thinking about ecosystems as becoming self-willed and self-regulating in their processes of healing, upgrading, natural disturbances, and the production of outputs such as carbon capture and biodiversity and abundance. So to backtrack a little, a common kind of post-1970s campaigning narrative focuses on biodiversity crisis, fixed time limits, climate catastrophe, and that's been a powerful tool in shaping policy and awareness. But despite its truth, this kind of finite earth narrative of shock, imagery of destruction, has not necessarily delivered the pace and intensity of changes that we need to reverse the biodiversity and climate crises. So conventional conservation has often been concerned with managing nature to achieve target states in more of a hold-the-line approach, whereas rewilding is about restoring food web dynamics and then letting nature lead. And it represents a shift from a more defensive focus on nature protection to a proactive agenda for nature recovery. And we feel that rewilding is now starting to assume the characteristics of a social movement. So social movements have driven positive change on issues such as civil rights, slavery, animal welfare. And a feature of the 20th century was the rise of social movements seeking to change and shape our relationship with the natural world. So to prevent extinctions, protect special places like national parks, ban harmful substances like DDT, neonicotinoids, and more recently, to avoid catastrophic climate catastrophe. And rewilding seems to have come in and kind of captured the public and political imagination with a kind of new narrative, clear goals and ambitions, and an increasingly varied set of case studies applied in different contexts from North America to Europe to our own country. But a key challenge for rewilding is the way in which we see our ecological history. So we've often used baselines that are less natural and more cultural. So in a European context, that could be the pre-industrial pastoral era for us before our EU membership, 1950s, 1960s. We often see nature declines in 40-year cycles or 50-year cycles. And in other places, kind of colonial arrivals in what were wrongly seen as untouched lands. And taking these periods to be the optimal states of nature means that what we want to conserve and where we want to get to are always a fraction of the picture. And that feeds into what is termed shifting baseline syndrome, which suggests that we cherish and conserve basically an ever-degraded nature as generation passes generation, and we set targets for that. And we think in a very human time frame and not in nature's through a kind of idealized imaginations of those past conditions. But rewilding, in my view, is pushing us to kind of think big and consider the long-term science to help us embrace transformational change. And it's about learning from past states of productive nature to understand our present and inform the future. And the key thing, I think, with rewilding is remembering that nature is a force, and if we take our foot off it, it will bounce back, and it's allowing it the space and the conditions to do so. And to do that, we must embrace kind of uncertain journeys, not jumping to desired end states, and learning to open opportunities for nature-based solutions along the way. So one of the things we often start with is asking our clients, landowners and managers that we work with to project into the future with a vision of what they want their land to do, who or what for, and why, and start to thinking about those different possibilities that new integrated land management approaches could bring. Some imagine a place where kind of regenerative agriculture, rewilding is blending into forestry and field sports. Others hold a vision of a wilder land where nature is expansively rebounding. And both of those places can have herds of grazing animals, thriving communities, ecosystem services, and exciting biodiversity flooding in. And that's opening opportunities in revenue streams from natural capital credits, produce, and leisure. Others see their role as providing new models to connect with policymakers, institutions, other projects, visitors, and investors. And they aim to meet like-minded people, share ideas, which in turn can create the conditions to build rural innovation hubs. In practice, we tend to employ a kind of three-pronged rewilding approach, which usually includes passive rewilding, so allowing nature to be unmanaged and to go its own way, which is probably the concept that is most talked about. but also assisted and accelerated rewilding where we're actively engaging with the ecosystems, such as in tree planting, animal introductions. So traditionally it's been taught that before humans, a squirrel could get from one side of the UK to the other without touching the ground in this closed canopy wildwood that stretches across the landscape as far as the eye could see. But rewilding science is now starting to challenge that idea. And we're now seeing evidence of the role of large herbivores in creating ever-changing patchworks. And Dutch ecologists formalize this in a cycle where thickets develop in grasslands and provide these thorny protective nurseries for trees. Over time, these trees will grow and shade out those thickets, which will then create groves. Those groves will eventually fall over, and then once again, the cycle starts with these grazing lawns that we see. So broadly, the aim of rewilding is to move from a neat countryside or neat countryside areas with a limited range of ecospaces to the restoration of a messy chaos with a variety of niches for animals to live, forage, breed, thrive. Specifically, restoring herbivores in natural densities is now considered to be the most effective way to restore biodiverse and abundant landscapes. Their grazing and trampling diversifies the structure of vegetation, scuffing disturbs the soil, their dung creates nutrient patches, and seeds are dispersed across the landscape in their coats. And it's often possible to develop a guild of cows, horses, and pigs to act as functional substitutes for the animals we've lost, such as wild boar, aurochs, tarpan, which is an old wild horse. And these native breeds, these rare hardy breeds, often have a legacy of thousands of years in this country and in other places in Europe, and can mimic valuable natural behaviors and add a wilder character to landscapes. And that can lead to connections with neighbors in cross-boundary grazing, mob rotational grazing, wood pastures, regenerative agriculture, and things like stockmanship, husbandry, livestock rearing, with new ways to instill hardiness in breeds and conserve rarer breeds by applying their behaviors in rougher and harsher landscapes. So technology can make this process easier for landowners and align better with rewilding projects. For example, the no-fence system is operated using a mobile app to set out pasture boundaries. The cattle wear GPS collars, and audio signals are emitted when those cattle reach a pasture boundary. And a small electric pulse is released through the collar if an animal is outside of that boundary for too long. And the animals quickly learn that to turn off the audio signal and avoid electric pulse, they must turn around and go back. So the no-fence system works in the same way as an electric fencing system, except as opposed to a physical cue, the electric fence, the animals learn an audio cue, which is the signal. And so that means that land managers can manipulate their movement to keep herds away from roads, protect wildflower or meadows or things under grants or HLS, prevent over or under grazing, protect springs, ground nesting birds. And no fence can be especially valuable in terms of planting, so safeguarding the vulnerable young trees and allowing access to other spaces to diversify different types of habitat. And that could potentially facilitate use in mixed forestry systems, with improved natural herd dynamics and reduced habitat fragmentation. So for many considering rewilding, leaving the land alone to regenerate naturally may not be financially feasible, and nor would it kind of generate the number of early stage opportunities that would otherwise be found. So we often work with projects that have been intensively grazed, loaded with nutrients, maxed out on monoculture farming or plantations. And left unmanaged, it could take decades for these lands to recover. And in these cases, using active rewilding to kickstart and then steer ecosystem processes could be best for both people and nature. So an example of that would be, for example, in improved pasture, a thick sward could develop, a matted sward over compacted soil where new growth struggles to break through. So actually getting kind of stuck in the early stages could give that ecosystem a helping hand and put it on a better trajectory to achieve biodiversity and abundance. So this particular map wasn't intended necessarily as a fixed design, a spec'd out design, but it was more as inspiration, and it focuses on a variety of scallop-shaped planting patches to create non-uniformity and soften the sharp transitions between the hedgerow areas and the depleted pastures. So we're encouraging our projects now to move away from kind of planting in straight lines with a low number of species to an approach that replicates natural regeneration and allows spaces in between for grazing lawns and meadows. And another component to this is that our awareness of plastics in ecosystems, helped on by Blue Planet 2, is improving. And people are now starting to question the use of plastic tree guards, but often people aren't sure of the alternatives. You know, they don't know where to start with that. So although biodegradable guards are improving, our first port of call is using natural solutions to protecting new trees. So mass-planted whips of thorny seeds can provide a protective apron for new emerging saplings to allow slower growing trees like oak to establish whilst encircling them with this thorny barrier. Hedge cuttings can be spread out to create a brush mat around the plantings, and deer will try to avoid walking over that dense material and will instead browse on the sticks and the twigs laid out. And other woody materials can create dead hedges to act as obstacles, and deer don't like jumping into small places, so the saplings within, the whips within, tend to be protected. And these measures can harmonise far better with the surrounding environment and can cultivate unique management insights and also, crucially, sustainable credentials for projects. But rewilding the land is all well and good, but unless it can pay, it's not going to be a viable alternative or an addition to more traditional land uses. And I think this is one of the criticisms that's often leveraged against advocates of rewilding, is that this is all well and good, this is all very fluffy, but actually, how's it going to work on the ground? How's it going to support landowners? How's it going to support communities? So solving the linked climate and nature emergency now has high-level political ambitions. The rise of environmental social governance, or ESG, is accelerating corporate and investor desire to become climate neutral, so do not harm, but now also nature positive, which is contributing to societal values. And there are new regulations requiring net positive in areas of commerce, and there is a growing landowner desire to transition into nature-based value generation, as has been touched on by the other speakers. And then COP26 and the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration has driven those new agendas forward. And there's a demand for multidisciplinary solutions and to move away from intensive forestry systems or farming systems to nature-positive approaches. So those are the opportunities, but what does it need? Well, in our view, it needs nature-positive goods that can be produced, traded, and invested in. It needs metrics that convert ecosystem enhancement into units, akin to, for example, a ton of carbon. And these need to be based on data that is trustworthy and verifiable. So to meet this, we've developed a framework that understands biodiversity and carbon capture as emergent properties or outputs of a functioning ecosystem of a land asset. And that asset is impacted for good or bad by inputs or human land use. And it translates key dimensions of natural processes, such as food webs, vegetation niches, into metrics based upon robust and cost-effective indicators. And these are designed to allow for community, landowner, student, volunteer capture. And to do that, we've enabled them to integrate existing data and local knowledge. And then we have a tiering system of kind of bronze, silver, and gold based on the confidence of different data inputs. So an example of that would be in the vegetation structural diversity one. That would be a difference between open access Environment Agency LiDAR versus a targeted LiDAR survey. So that's your bronze and gold different approaches. And those are different cost points. EA1 is free. The other one could cost $2,000 or $3,000. And so the metrics can also be curated and packaged to respond to different priorities, such as ELM scheme, farming and protected landscape scheme, to go beyond the biodiversity net gain metric, or to verify ecosystem improvements and inform strategies and visions for land management, knowing exactly what is going on in your landscape so you can target those interventions. And it helps to tell the story of change with data that accurately reveals how the ecosystem is doing. So using these metrics, our team are in the process of developing a rewilding token. So what on earth is that? Well, to use an analogy, if you think of a derelict factory, that space could either be converted into housing and revenues drawn from property sales, or revenues drawn from property sales or rentals, or you could develop the building into a museum or a cultural centre. And tickets and cafe could comprise part of the earnings for that, but it also holds important social functions that can be invested in by corporates, funds, philanthropists. And in a similar way, buying Rewilding tokens is an investment in the story of a project that can open opportunities in PR, marketing, feelings of pride for buyers, and it represents a stake in a recovering land asset as a verified contributor to ecosystem recovery. So tokens have similar functions to credits, but whereas biodiversity and carbon credits are official recognition of kind of no harm, the token publicly and commercially recognizes a buyer's contribution to nature-positive initiatives and social values. So it's designed to be a financial vehicle that is scalable and backed by trustworthy data. And the token can be linked to benefits such as access to expertise, events, memberships, discounts, and then priorities on the carbon credits that can originate from ecosystem recovery, so rights of refusal on those credits. And crucially, the tokens are based on evidence of future delivery as opposed to trust of future delivery, and can be released in editions that allow an investor or buyer to showcase incremental improvements in ecosystem uplift. And these rights can be bought, sold, or retired. So the token can seem unsettling in terms of the commodification of nature, but it aims to use existing financial systems that can be harmful, but can also be redeployed for good and reduce greenwashing. We feel it's far better to present an offer as opposed to an ask for nature recovery funds, in recognizing that all land is an asset and needs to generate value, and rewilding needs to at least wash its own face if we're going to be able to scale it. So our ecosystem health check is a key part of the tokenization processes. Conceptually, it sees humans as hyper-ecosystem engineers who historically have forced ecosystems to produce commodities such as timber, crops, livestock, but can now engineer ecosystems to produce other outcomes. And the index assesses the downgrading or upgrading effects of past and present land uses on ecosystem function. And it enables landowners to better understand where and how nature is being boosted on their land or constrained through a scorecard for land uses and land use practices. And with landowners and managers, we then set ambition levels and explore what restorative actions they can realistically take. And these interventions are also scored, and the expected ecosystem uplift can be modeled. And that forecast is converted to tokens, where each represents a hectare. So a participating 200 hectare farm could release 200 tokens. And tokenizing the recovery of land assets will also help to provide the startup finance and the knowledge to craft vibrant landscapes with new enterprise models. And the land management commitments decided through the health check can recognize the technological, social, and economic realities that are shaping a specific site and wider society to identify those kind of harmonizing or synergistic revenue streams to help a project out. So for example, carbon markets are now beginning to distinguish between immediate carbon stored in trees, but now also permanent carbon stored in soil pools and the wider ecosystem. And as awareness is growing of the risk associated with tree carbon, which has been previously mentioned with disease, windfall, pests, interest is growing now in premium carbon. And rewilding accelerates the transformation of carbon captured by plants into these pools, creating mosaics that reduce the risk of fire and disease and potentially de-risking those carbon credits. And there may be future opportunities for premium packages of rewilding tokens plus nature-positive carbon, which we're exploring at the moment. But emerging markets for rewilding tokens and other credits aren't the only way to generate revenues, as shown here at the top of the screen and on the right in experiences and produce sales and revenues. So the holistic nature of rewilding, bringing in kind of large charismatic animals, produce, spaces for exploration, foraging, unique feelings can be capitalized on in profitable nature-based experiences. Innovations in accommodation, premium ethical meat, safaris, e-mobility, and can be powerful entrepreneurial tools to fund and scale a project. That can link with employment opportunities, relationships with complementary local businesses, such as restaurants, but also schools and institutions that can come and take part and engage in that project and achieve value for them. So assets specifically, they might include things like eco-pods, all-terrain e-scooters, private safari, hide and dining experiences, and mindfulness activities, retreats, and vending lockers for wilded meats that the guests can come and access kind of hands-free. So consumer behavior trends are starting to now show that distinctive accommodation, stress and travel-free recreational prospects, a closeness to nature, and a secluded and attractive setting is becoming a slightly more important factor than location. We're currently working with the land agents to create a rewilding business model for a Yorkshire upland farm to put these ideas into practice. So these personalized experiences can build physical and mental wellness and overall life quality for both providers and participants. There's a great Expedia ad circulating at the moment with Ewan McGregor talking about our love of stuff, but questioning if we'll look back on our lives and not regret not getting a slightly sportier car, and even thinner TV, smarter smartphone. But then questioning, what about the places we didn't go and the things we didn't do? And to me, it's pretty bang on the money. And with rewilding, it's about wild nature providing respite from our often busy and chaotic lives, and that can have a monetary value. And this links with a final question asked by Kevin Kelly, which is, in a world where everything is becoming copyable, streamable, shareable, and rentable, what will become valuable? And his answer was immersive, personalized, embodied experiences that connect to our values and interests. As we move into the post-Brexit era, there's an opportunity to reevaluate how we construct our landscape and the opportunities that they'll create. And we're seeing that recognized in interesting government grants, as Jay talked about, and schemes and new demands from the private sector. And it's looking like landscape scale recovery will have a place in the new payments for public goods system with ELMS Tier 3. And with rewilding quickly entering the zeitgeist, it's likely we're going to see publicly and privately funded nature restoration with potentially pioneering rural enterprises as well. So hopefully that whistle-stop tour of rewilding kind of land use and finance was useful. Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak, and I'll be happy to take any questions if we're not running over.
Well, thanks so much for that, Daniel. I found that absolutely inspiring, to be honest, and really, really makes you think outside the box, actually. What are the mechanisms we can use, thinking about, forestry investment in the traditional sense, actually, what are the opportunities? And, hey, if all the good for nature that we can do at the same time, we can feel good about it as well, I would hope. I'm sure there's some questions. Yes, there's one at the back straight away.
I'd just like to say, great moustache, great presentation, and are you guys market leaders in this country?
In rewilding?
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. we like to think so. We like to think so. There's not a lot of rewilding businesses specializing in rewilding land management consultancy. There's even fewer people doing rewilding finance and business models. There's a couple of emerging people coming in, but they tend to be buying land up themselves. We don't want to do that. We want to basically support existing land assets, people who aim to buy land assets with that process and trying to maximize value on those land assets. Yeah.
Hi, it's an opportune picture you've got on there. We've been trying to get our local council to not quite rewild an area, but graze it with Exmoor ponies.
Yeah.
The croppers being the cost of fencing. Does this no fence system really work? And would it work with Exmoor ponies?
It will not. Me and my colleague Emily were talking about this on the way over, actually. The problem with no fence in a rewilding context is it's absolutely fantastic for cattle. They're now starting to trial it with sheep, seeing really good results with sheep, and sheep can be used as, wouldn't usually hear it from somebody interested in rewilding with the whole conversation with George Monbiot and the white plague and things like that. But sheep can do really good things in managing meadows, and so no fence is starting to come in there. But the problem with horses is that when they get the electric shock, they bolt, and it's really unsafe. And they don't tend to realise that the sound means that, and they can kind of return. So at the moment, it seems to be cows and sheep that it's big for. Next step will most likely be pigs, and then horses hopefully down the line. But they're constantly innovating, and so hopefully they'll come up with something soon.
I'm personally going to keep an eye on it because I really, really want something to keep my teenage sons away from the fridge. Any more before we move to the panel? I mean, just to say, I think your talk was absolutely on the money, like you stated, and there's so many opportunities. Whilst you gave us a really nice overview, actually, I think the challenge for us is to think about, okay, when we're looking at our individual projects, actually, how can we challenge our thinking and think what are the opportunities beyond what we might traditionally just think of? Because, like you say, you encapsulated it by thinking, are people prepared to pay for stuff, or do they want experiences? And we know, you've seen a lot of pods and shepherd's huts in the landscape. That's the basics. But how can we take advantage of this trend in our sector? Oh, so I've just sparked a couple more questions, maybe. One,
Thank you. Very quick question. Do you think there's a minimum area size that it's worth trying to do rewilding in?
So, in short answer, no. I think that although one of the principles of rewilding is kind of working at a landscape scale, so endeavouring to work at a landscape scale, we're seeing lots of really interesting projects pop up now where we call them pocket rewilding projects that can then be connected up with other people in your local area through community networks, but also we're working with Thames Water at the moment on lots of these pocket sites. When you get that portfolio of sites together, then you can start thinking about how connecting them through the landscape, through cross-boundary kind of relationships with farmers, landowners, working along riparian river corridors, and then also hedgerows and things like that. So rewilding principles, I haven't actually included it as a slide on here, but I'd be happy to send it to anyone. So I use the definition on here, but I think often to get a real flavour of what rewilding is in our context, it's quite a little bit different in America, where they kind of look at more the kind of carnivores and cores and wilderness areas. It's often good to look at rewilding principles. So in 2019, European kind of rewilding practitioners and scientists all came together and just sat down and wanted to kind of put a stop to the confusion about what rewilding is and just really kind of map out a set of principles. And those principles can be applied on lots of different scales. So one of them is working at nature scale, but actually other principles can be woven into things as small as gardens. With the work with Thames Water, those were kind of 10 to 20 hectare sites.
Perfect. Right. On that note, can I please invite all the speakers to the panel area? And we've got a little bit of time set aside now before lunch for general discussion. So if anyone has any thoughts, doesn't even necessarily have to be questions. I'm happy just to take people's views or on any of the subjects discussed, or indeed anything that hasn't been discussed, just to get thoughts.
Because there's a point in Emma's presentation where she was talking about, I think, management plans, and she said, this is something Tilhill can offer, and looked straight at me, and I was sort of just away with the fairies just for that moment and just blanked her in the middle of her presentation. So I apologise for that. I think that is something that Tilhill can definitely offer. And there was also, wasn't there a question somewhere for Dan that we didn't get to in the front?
Oh yeah, my apologies. Yes, so there's one.
Sorry. I'm really interested in the tokens. It's really cool. So have you had many corporates that you were testing this with and that are looking at this, and how are they kind of comparing it to, say, carbon credits? Because obviously that's easy to offset, but this goes beyond carbon. It's biodiversity.
Yep.
So I'm just interested to hear a bit more about that, really.
So we currently have several pilot projects where we're applying the kind of NARIA framework on which that's the underlying verification tool for the token. So we're getting all of these in place. Those projects range from kind of 200 hectares to potentially kind of 10,000. So we're applying those metrics with a view to then engage with those landowners in tokenizing. In terms of the corporate and investor interest, we're currently working with the Oxford Smith School to look at token markets. And these impact tokens that are based around those kind of aspirational values. Currently, those markets are emerging and are still forming. So we are also looking at what our place will be within those markets. There are other impact tokens coming out. The World Wildlife Trust released one recently, which was slightly different. It was more of a kind of just a kind of charity-based thing, where our one can be kind of bought, entered into accounts, sold. But we're still exploring it. We have one client who in Yorkshire, actually 2 or 3 clients in Yorkshire now who have expressed interest in releasing a token with us, and they are private land holdings, but also kind of a large organisation that we'd all be familiar with.
And just to add on to that, it's obviously important it works cross-border as well, this kind of thing. So have you got any ties with other countries to...
Yeah. We do. We're working with CBio in Portugal, and then we are exploring some conversations in Africa as well.
A quick follow-up from me, Dan, if that's all right. I mean, obviously with carbon, we've got all the regulatory framework with the Woodland Carbon Code, which and additionality and reassurance for buyers and so on. What's the structure around the tokens at the moment?
And its interface with carbon, and the kind of the code and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So if I'm a prospective buyer of a token, you know, how do I know that if I buy a token in Portugal, I'm getting the same kind of standards and so on, or how, is there not what's the situation?
So we've currently drafted a carbon standard. We don't again, it's not my specialty, but we don't think the Woodland Carbon Code is particularly robust. And we've now we're creating a new carbon standard, nature positive carbon standard, that we would hope to get buy-in from the standards authorities quite soon. Okay. On the NARIA framework, there was one thing there, which was carbon was part of the ecosystem outputs slide, and that we don't provide ourselves, but we're looking to small and medium enterprises to come in on that carbon aspect. One of the companies that we're talking with has a new technology. So as opposed to the Woodland Carbon Code, which more is looking at kind of tree trunk carbon and using that as a kind of proxy for the tree carbon, they are now taking into account the full canopy model for each tree to be able to accurately model and then predict years into the future of that carbon uptake. And they're seeing potentially a far greater level of returns in carbon. So we're hoping that will accelerate, and potentially there will be different approaches to carbon that the government can then build into their existing models.
Okay. Okay, another one from me, it sounds like. I mean, Xander, you gave us a big overview at the start. I guess we've had a couple of questions and different themes, you know, tax, this potential, you know, for biodiversity tokens in the future. We've got the grants, which are maybe a bit more solid and stable. I mean, thinking about England right now, from a kind of investor's perspective, what do you think are the main moving parts in a kind of land acquisition-based investment?
Yeah, so, you know, stepping even out from that a little bit, you know, I think that when we talk about this kind of, you know, whole landscape use and how do we best use the land, we talk about the obviously the kind of innovation that's happening in the rewilding space, and then we've got, you know, I mentioned, I think in response to another question, how you know, even carbon credits are still fairly nascent. We haven't had a verified carbon credit transact yet in the UK because the regulations haven't been around long enough for a tree to grow since they came about. And then we have forestry, which obviously has been a business model that's existed for centuries. I don't even know how many years we want to put on that. So, it's a nice backbone with whatever you intend to do. It's also interesting that Rewilding's bringing in accommodation, which is another ancient business model. I think actually the oldest existing company in the world is a hotel in Japan. So when I start thinking about stepping back and thinking about, hey, we're going to acquire land, regardless of whether it's for straight forestry or a more broader perspective, there's different aspects of the business model that we can have different degrees of confidence in. And it's very easy with forestry to kind of dump it in a spreadsheet because I know how quickly a tree is going to grow based on my colleague's assessment of the site, which is based on soil types or the like growth of trees nearby, the expectations for climate and such. And then I can put a forecast in for, hey, timber price is going to grow at X% per year, and we're going to harvest it in 35 years' time. So I can get a number out quite easily. So I think what Peter's kind of alluding to in that question is that when you put together a spreadsheet of a forest, there's actually only a few key variables that really make the difference. And one of them, as was the response to a question earlier, is your species choice. So with my armed with my spreadsheet and not necessarily armed with my with various other filters, I'm looking at, well, how much of this is Sitka spruce, because that's going to be our most valuable crop. So that's one variable. The next variable is going to be my timber price, because small fluctuations in timber price can have a really huge impact on the financial returns of forestry. There was a challenging question from towards the back of the room earlier about, hey, we've felled timber either because it got felled for us by a storm or by pests and diseases or some other non-economic factor, and it's not left us with enough money to replant. I mean, ideally, your replanting costs should be at most a third of what you've harvested, even if the timber wasn't of brilliant quality. Or perhaps if it's pests and diseases, you might be getting paid to fell or paid to replant by a plant health order trying to get you to take out those crops, or as Peter mentioned, by insurance. So that was a kind of a little bit of a diversion off. But anyway, so we've got our timber prices, which are more and more supportive of economic replanting, economic thinning to maximize the amount of timber that you can grow. And so that makes a significant difference. Our species choices I already established. And then the discount rate. So this is the effectively what you're expecting as a return from your forest. Because I came from a world where we're trying to find the next Google or Facebook to invest in, and your forest probably isn't going to do that for you. But funnily enough, people from those worlds would take the money that they'd made and then put it into forests. And you think, well, that's kind of bizarre, right? If you've made sort of 100 times your money in shares in Facebook, why are you now coming on to forestry? And it's because the risk is much lower. So people expect a less of a return. They're kind of like, this is wealth preservation. So as long as it's, I think you used the term wiping its face. So it's not costing you anything. Forestry's ahead of that. You can make money out of forestry. But the good thing is that it's such an old industry and a predictable industry, and the trees aren't affected by economic cycles. The tree will keep growing at its same rate regardless of what the stock market's doing. So generally, people will expect a slightly lower return from it. It's also influenced by the tax incentives that Emma talked about. So depending on sort of the rate of return that you're expecting is also, that goes into your spreadsheet, and that will really change what the spreadsheet says about how valuable this forest is going to be to you. So that's your three big things: is species choice, your timber price, and then really what your baseline expectation is out of forestry and how it fits into your broader portfolio of assets.
Thank you very much, Sander.
Sorry, that was a bit of an essay.
Yeah, no, but that's, you've given us a comprehensive picture. I sense the room, especially perhaps after that comprehensive answer, is ready.
I will just ask one.
Oh, no, we have one, yes.
On the carbon credits front, if you are allocated credits, these things last an awful long time. How do you control into future generations? I mean, you know, I can remember for the next 10 years, hopefully, or whatever, 20 years. But what about in 40 years? Who knows I've got them? Where are they registered, we'll call it, at the moment?
There's actually something called a registry, I believe.
That's pretty cool.
But let me expand on that, because I think there is an important consideration in there that there's the Woodland Carbon Code is a government-backed system where you have to register your project. It's where it is. It's what you've planted. There's a estimation of how much carbon you're going to sequester, and when you get given your carbon credits, a chunk are held back for two reasons. One is because nobody knows exactly what's going to happen, and the other is because some projects will just burn down, or there'll be fraud. Someone will say, I'm planting these trees, and then they'll disappear to the Maldives, and we'll never hear from them again. I'm not saying that's your intention, obviously. But then what happens is that goes in a pool, and that's insurance for all of the other ones, so that the impact of the scheme overall is still to have sequestered the amount of carbon that was set out to be sequestered. But the important consideration here is that you're signing up to tend to these trees for up to 100 years. So what you don't want to do is buy a patch of land or plant up your own land and then just sell off all the carbon credits, because then you've got 100 years of hopefully paying one of our colleagues to show up every so often and check that the trees are still growing. So better to keep some back as an income source to cover your costs over that period, so that you're not getting to year 70 or 80 when perhaps, I think most of us in this room sadly might not still be here, but there's still some income in order to tend to the trees and fulfill the obligation to keep that carbon sequestered for the lifetime of the project.
Yeah, and if it's right, then I think I could add in that some of these agreements that are going on between purchasers of carbon units and vendors, there's not a one-size-fits-all there. If you don't feel you don't want certain obligations, that it's possible to pass obligations on to the purchasers of units. So you can flex what you're doing.
But if your intention is to keep in perpetuity, you're therefore going to have to do a wear and K and make damn sure that your heirs, etc., know what's going on.
Absolutely. I see no reason why you shouldn't treat it as an asset. And in your will, I don't see why you couldn't specifically give away the benefits of the carbon credits. It's like digital assets today. It's a specific area in wills. You may have all sorts of digital assets which you haven't thought about before, but it's a growth area where you're being asked to consider to specifically deal with these in your will. And I don't see why you shouldn't deal in the same way with carbon credits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. If the units are unsold, but you've gone through the registration and validation process, you are the owner of the rights.
That's my point.
Yeah. So it's just part of your asset
of your
base.
estate, yeah, absolutely.
Sorry. Oh, quite one here.
Thank you. So I guess as a corporate investor, I have a Xander spreadsheet that at the beginning of this, I thought told me everything I needed to know about potentially our business investing in carbon credit generation by insetting. You've ruined that, so thank you very much. I now need to go and look at business tax. I now need to go and look at potential opportunities of rewilding and using that land differently. So is it possible that as a new business looks into this, we can get Tilhill and other companies working together to give a business a kind of holistic view of what is possible with both carbon credits and potential other future credit opportunities.
Xander?
Yeah, so I think at Tilhill we're always trying to innovate and expand our horizons. I think this is something that certainly Peter is always pushing for. Where do we want to be? And I said, you know, forestry can be the backbone of something, but what we do is land management. You know, the skill set that we have is quite broadly applicable, but there are areas where we just have to accept we're not the leading expert. So if we needed something like planning permission for residences, for recreation, we'd bring in a partner or we'd work with a partner that you brought to us. Tax is a particular area that we're not even allowed to give advice. So that's why we want to foster partnerships with kind of experts in that area. Otherwise, you're not going to get the quality of advice that we can give you on trees, on all of these different aspects.
Right. Well, I can see in the back of the room steaming, inviting looking luncheon containers. So on that note, thank you very much to all our panelists. I've certainly learned a huge amount and look forward to chatting to everyone over lunch.
Can I say a quick thank you to Olivia, who's hiding at the back there, who really has done the absolute bulk of the work in organising the event today. So
yes.
Thank you very much. Sorry to embarrass you. And for those of you who aren't local, I think we might have dessert with lunch, but the ice cream here in Ripley is really good stuff. It's worth sampling if you've come from a distance.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone.
Cheers, guys.